Hello, and welcome to Persyst Grand Rounds, an online series of lectures hosted by Persyst, covering topics related to advanced EEG analysis for improving outcomes in both neurocritical care and epilepsy monitoring environments. My name is Katie Colabreeze with Persyst, and I'm here to introduce our speaker and topic for today's Persyst Grand Rounds. Through our customers, we understand the importance of investing in the EEG community through education, where expertise and knowledge can grow towards the utilization and implementation of EEG and quantitative EEG. The goal of Persyst Grand Rounds is to provide a platform for those with clinical expertise on topics of advanced EEG analysis as a way to connect with a broader community to share their expertise and knowledge so that we can all learn and grow together. Each online lecture features an experienced epileptologist or neurophysiologist presenting on a topic of their choice as it relates to EEG monitoring and analysis. Please visit www.persyst.com/grandrounds to keep up to date. The schedule is subject to change. Conflicts of interest. The opinions and viewpoints of each speaker are solely their own and do not represent Persyst or any other commercial entity or commercial interest. Speakers are not required to include Persyst, its software, products, or services. The content presented was not prepared or edited by Persyst, and Persyst is not providing any form of compensation. There will be time for questions after the talk, so please write your questions in the Q&A area. There's a button at the bottom of your screen. We welcome today Dr. Christophe Grova. Christophe Grova is professor in the Department of Physics of Concordia University and a research member of the Concordia School of Health, the Perform Center, since July 2014, while remaining adjunct professor affiliated to the Biomedical Engineering Department and Neurology and Neurosurgery departments at McGill Faculty of Medicine. He's also affiliated with the Epilepsy Group of the Montreal Neurological Institute, MNI, the McConnell Brain Imaging Center of the MNI, and is a member of the FISNM team at the Centre de Recherche Mathématique. He received his engineering and master degrees in biomedical engineering at the University of Technology of Compiègne, France, in 1998, followed by a Ph.D. in SPECT MRI registration at University of France. From 2003 to 2008, his postdoctoral studies at the MNI were focused on EEG source imaging of epileptic discharges and the correspondence with EEG fMRI results, while acting as part-time research associate for the setup of the MEG Center of the University of Montreal in 2006 to 2008. Dr. Grova has been assistant professor at McGill from July 2008 to July 2014. Since 2008, he's the director of the Multimodal Functional Imaging Laboratory, which is now located on both the McGill and Concordia campuses. His areas of expertise are EEG MEG source localization, multimodal data fusion involving EEG MEG, fMRI, and FNIRS for application in epilepsy and sleep research. Dr. Grova is the scientific lead of the physiology platform at the Perform Center, promoting neuroimaging in realistic lifestyle environments using wearable technology like EEG and FNIRS. His team is also handling the development and validation of two software packages, MEM and Brainstorm for EEG MEG source localization, and NearStorm for FNIRS data analysis. Today, Dr. Grova will speak on the EEG source imaging of epileptic spikes and the effect of sleep stage. The learning objectives for today will be to first understand the possibility of assessing the source of epileptic discharges in EEG with their underlying spatial extent, to assess whether EEG source imaging of epileptic spikes is consistent across sleep states, and to evaluate the accuracy of EEG source imaging of ongoing resting state activity. And with that, I hand it over to you, Professor Grova.
Thank you, Katie, for the nice introduction. Thank you, Persyst team, for the invitations. I'm very happy to be here today to present our work, especially on source imaging. And just as a note, so I got quite interested in the clinical community using Persyst, where I'm doing engineer work, so methodological development. So I'm I'm not a Persyst user per se. I just wanted to clarify. So some of my results, because of the history, I will show a little bit of Meg, and then I will show you how we applied those technology in the context of EEG work I've been doing very closely with my main collaborator, Dr. Birgit Frauscher from Duke. So I will now start. So our program for this morning is first, I want to give you an overview of source imaging in epilepsy and the importance of assessing the spatial extent. So not localizing epileptic activity as a single point, as a single dipole, but more as a patch, and why this is important, and what are the methods we developed that are able to do so. So I'll give a rapid tour of several things we apply, on which we apply these methods before going into the main focus of today, which is first, we're going to see how we could localize epileptic spikes in EEG in different sleep stages to see whether there is an influence of sleep on epileptic spike source imaging. And in the second aspect, we will address what we can do when we don't have spikes and whether we can still retrieve relevant information from ongoing resting state data. And we will characterize resting state data in different sleep stages in comparison with intracranial EEG data. So I'll start with that. I'd like to start with that. Of course, I guess most of you are epilepsy experts, so they know definitely what an EEG spike is, as you see here on the scalp EEG. And the reason I'm showing this, because this was a simultaneous scalp EEG and ECOG data done by the group of Tao in Chicago. And what you can see is when you see those spikes here on the cortex, you see a few spikes here, you see that underlying in the intracranial EEG space, whether it is with SEEG or with ECOG data, we see a lot more. And usually to see those spikes occurring with a good signal to noise as on the surface, it cannot be a single tiny point in the brain. So you need to have a sufficiently extended synchronous generator to see such a strong spike that we are all interested in when we look at scalp EEG. So the underlying generator of epileptic discharge is spatial extended, and it's been shown using different studies that the area associated to a spike generator along the cortex is quite large. So EEG data have suggested 4 to 8 square centimeter. MEG studies are saying more 3 to 4 square centimeter, but it's not a point. It is several square centimeter. It can even be larger. And I would like to mention that most of these measures were done in comparing scalp data with ECOG. And as you can see on this representation, ECOG is just seeing just a tiny part on the cortical surface because you don't see the depth of the sulci. So those estimations might be underestimation, and the actual extent might be even larger. And of course, we have to consider the fact that when you put an ECOG grid, you have also signal attenuation in the middle and amplification on the border that might change those numbers. So don't take these exact numbers for granted, but spatial extent is important. So let's just take as an example. I will show you a lot of EEG, but sorry, I will have few MEG slices because I have a lot of experience in MEG. So here you have a spike topography, spike MEG. If you localize that with your preferred dipole model, you would find your favorite dipoles right in the hippocampus. And I would say this is clearly a wrong localization. Of course, a good interpretation of your dipole would see that you have a large amplitude dipole with a specific orientation, meaning that it is an extended generator on the cortex that ended up there. But that's very important to take that into account. And the true generator that we localize here is probably something more cortical like that. It doesn't mean that the hippocampus is not involved. It is probably involved, and there is a propagation from the hippocampus to the cortical surface. But the signal, the strong signal we measure on scalp EEG is the signal that has propagated on the surface. So we developed this package together with my close collaborator, Dr. Jean-Marc Lina from École de Technologie Supérieure. And so this package that I'm going to talk a lot today is called MEM. So it stands for maximum entropy on the mean. I will mention it. And if you would like to use it, it is freely available, and we put it with different resources. in an open source package, which is called Brainstorm, which is a well-known package when you want to do EEG or MEG source imaging. And we have two main flavors of MEM. We have MEM in the time domain, and this is particularly interesting method if you want to localize the generator of different types of activity, and notably epileptic spikes, and to assess their spatial extent. And I will show you how it works mainly. And there's a second aspect where we do this localization, but not in the time domain, but in the time frequency domain after applying a wavelet decomposition. So this is called a wavelet MEM. And this is quite good, and I'll show you a few illustrations to localize oscillatory patterns, so notably high frequency oscillation or ictal oscillations at the seizure onset zone, for instance. Just very rapidly, this is my only method slides. I just want to, perhaps for those who are interested in the method, I want just to clarify what MEM method is. Happy to take more question at the end. You have some reference here where the mathematical developments behind the MEM have been more described. The original paper being this paper by Amblard, developed by Jean-Marc Lina. So the idea, we are solving source localization in a distributed model. So we put dipoles all along the cortical surface. And at every time point, we want to create a map along that cortical surface. As every method, I guess in Persyst, you are probably familiar with S-Loretta or minimum norm technique. As every source localization technique, the problem is ill-posed. You need to make mathematical assumptions to find the solutions. And MEM is doing that, like S-Loretta, like minimum norm, like all these other techniques. In a very nutshell, we put some of our prior information in a distribution. We have a set of all the distribution that explain the data, so all the set of infinite number of possible solutions. And if we find one, we measure the distance between our prior, what we know, and this distribution using entropy. And MEM is just decreasing, taking the minimum distance in terms of minimum entropy. It's maximum because it's a negative value. And what is interesting in MEM, and I don't want to mention the math here, but it's just that it is based on a model saying that your brain has been parcelized and every parcels could be active or not. So basically, the only thing I want you to remember is that MEM as a parcels, the size of the parcel doesn't matter that much, but it's a way to regularize the problem. So in a way, when you applied MEM localization, the system will put the parcel on and off. And when the parcel is on, it's a kind of Loretta or S-Loretta on the parcels. And this is this property of putting parcels on and off that allows a better estimation of the spatial extent as opposed to other studies. This was investigated very first, just the property of the inverse problem. This is done in MEG and this is done in high density EEG, 256 electrode EEG. And you have an extended source here, and you see when you look at the property of your resolution method, you'll see the ability of MEM compared with minimum norm DSPM S-Loretta to recover this. As you can see, all the methods find the maximum of the activity, but the spatial spread around the method is more confined with MEM. And so that was done on simulation data. This is real data. So here it's done in MEG on 5LC controls during a median nerve stimulation. So you have the peak here at 20 milliseconds, and you see the MEM reconstruction in S1 regions in comparison to the other method here, like S-Loretta is here. This is the same result now, where you see the distribution of distance from the presumed S1 regions in the different methods. This is for left median nerve, right median nerve, MEM, minimum norm, DSPM, S-Loretta. So again, we are quite focused, and we reproduce the same result, a bit more noisy, but quite accurate as well for high density EEG when compared. So this standard behavior is something we've been reproducible. We tested that on clinical data, and of course, we tested that on epilepsy data. So in this first study, again, sorry, it's a MEG study. and I'll show you how we extended it later. So this is 49 patients, 340 studies, and we compared using sublobar accuracy how the standard method, so dipole fitting, is concordant with this MEM technique. And overall, we find out that the dipole, even if it has bias, was doing a good job and doing a good localization in 70% of the case, and MEM, we increased to 81%, so 10% more. And then we extended this study not to dipole fitting, but to distributed models. So again, you have an example here of a spike. This region is a presumed focal cortical dysplasia, and you see the MEM map compared to S Loretta, minimum norm, and DSPM. As you see, and we saw that over all our patients, that if you look at the distance to the presumed focus, all the methods localize well the peak of the activity, which within less than 1 centimeter from the focus. So that was good. But when you look at the spatial spread around that regions that was delimited by our experts, you see that only MEM is within those zones. All the other methods are extending too much. And this is the pattern that is true whether you are doing EEG or MEG. And this is just to give you another idea. You have a broader, you have 12 different examples of spike localization, and I'm showing you the map without thresholding. So to illustrate how this idea of having partial shutting down are ending up in a very nice and clean map. So that's the main message. Then we wanted to further evaluate that with intracranial EEG data. So here we combine EEG and MEG to do source imaging. We use also EEG fMRI, and we compared with intracranial EEG data. And in this study, I will walk through just one example here. Here you have the EEG, the MEG and the EEG spike. In this example, I'm using the 2 data sets, so EEG and MEG, to get a nice localizations. Then we had also not simultaneously intracranial SEEG data for the same patients. So you have the spike that have been marked with this profile and a seizure that have been marked. And then what we did is we converted this EEG MEG source into the SEEG space. We did that by applying an SEEG forward model. So we are creating virtual SEEG information. And this is what we did. So this is our different electrode, and this is how MEG and EEG is projecting in that SEEG space, or this is what we are estimated from EEG and MEG in this SEEG space. So this is from scalp data. This is what we measure, and there is a nice correspondence in this case. And then we did more or less the same with fMRI. What we show from that studies is that overall EEG and MEG localize very well the primary irritative zone. That's not a surprise, where we see spike on SEEG. Interestingly, the fMRI was similar response to the same spikes, where it's measuring the bold, so the hemodynamic activity was closer located to the seizure onset. So that's not our purpose. That was just an illustration. This is the same study now comparing with the surgical cavity, and that's just a tour, as I say. Here you have EEG MEG localization for non-seizure-free and seizure-free patients compared to the ground truth, which is the presumed focus. And we see that for seizure-free, compared to the cavity, I would say. So for seizure-free result, our localization were closer or inside the cavity and the area under the ROC curve. So they were nicely spatially overlapping with the cavity. And we got similar result with fMRI. Now let's go more to some EEG result. I'd like to start by showing you this nice result worked in collaboration, close collaboration with the group of Birgit Frauscher and also with Dr. Jean Gottman, dealing with the fact that in clinical setups, and I'm sure many of you are facing that, some of the standard approach is to use lower density EEG. So here you have a 25 EEG montage. And actually, and this is similar data sets that I'm going to use later, in collaboration with Birgit, what we did is we acquired during a long period, actually all night data, relatively high density EEG. We were gluing electrode on the scalp. So this is a 83 EEG. And we looked from this montage how I can downsample and still look at the accuracy of the source imaging. So what was done? So our reference was high-density EEG and the source localization from there. And from the clinical perspective, the epileptologist only see the low-density EEG, so standard clinical 10, 20, 25 electrodes. Look at the electrodes where the highest amplitude was marked, or the inflation, the phase inflations in bipolar montage. And from that, we created a targeted density montage by adding 8 to 10 electrodes around this electrode showing the maximum activity. So that's something that could easily be done in clinical practice, which is you have your standard clinical montage plus few electrodes where you expect to see the activity. And we blindly evaluated this source map to that source map compared to our ground truth, which was again assessed based on clinical assessment. So basically presence of a lesions, eventually presence of a cavity when the patient has been operated, or other clinical hypothesis. And these are a few examples of a map from this low density targeted montage or for this high density. And as you can see, a lot of those maps were actually nicely concordant. So you don't need to have such a high accuracy. It might not be the case in other kind of signal, but when you are localizing this kind of signals that are spike signals with very high amplitude, you are getting this. And in these evaluations, you have the distance between the peak on the two analyses, so low density and high density EEG. And here you have the qualitative evaluation of our experts, where the expert looked at the two maps without knowing which was the targeted low density or the high density, and he rated as 1 if the two maps were completely different, and as 5 if they were completely similar. And then if our result was overall in sublobar concordance with what we presume should be the localization, it was in grid, and discordance when it was in red. And you see overall a quite good concordance between this targeted montage localization with MEM compared to high density EEG with MEM. So MEM is also able to show interesting stability in those non-uniform montage, which is very interesting clinically. As just an illustrations before I go to the sleep analysis, we can do MEM in oscillatory patterns. So this is a seizure recording in EEG and MEG. So what we can do here is we identify the beginning of the seizure. We look in the time frequency domain. For the technical note, we then look in the discrete time frequency domain to see that, oh, something is occurring around 18 to 35 hertz around that time. And then every box of that space, we are localizing it using MEM. And then we look only at the beginning here to detect the seizure onset zone. So I won't say more about that. Just an illustration. We got the chance to have a patient who did electrographic seizures, as you can see here. We have several examples of electrographic seizures. We apply that method to localize them. And this is a presumed dysplasia here. This is the localization of the spike. And these are all the seizure localization that were quite consistent. And finally, talking about EEG, another study done with Birgit and Tamira Victor here, where we wanted to compare spike localization with gamma oscillation rising closely to the spike, just before or on the rising phase of the spike, as you can see. So these are spike gamma. So you have your spike and you have those little oscillations that were clearly not filtered artifact. And then when we localize both of them, we saw for different cases that the fast oscillation localization and the spike oscillations were overall quite concordant. And for most of them, they were falling within the surgical cavity for those patients. So that concludes my first part. So now let's go a little bit beyond and let's see how we can use that to study EEG in different sleep stage. So I will mainly talk about this paper that was published 1 year ago. So it's known from the literature, there are several studies that are showing that epileptic spike, interictal epileptic spikes occurrence and scalp morphology will vary with vigilance state. You have more spike occurrence in deep sleep, and also the shape might vary in the different sleep stages. So there are very few studies who did EEG source imaging of spike in different vision states, and they are suggesting overall that the source of spikes occurring during REM are more focal. That's the main image, is that when you look from the scalp point of view and then from the source point of view, the generator seems more focal, and the question is it more important clinically? And so the paper from Kang et al. Did a study with high-density EEG in only 6 patients, and MacLeod et al., they did a study on EEG in 16 patients, but using low-density 25 electrode montage. So our objective was to assess the reliability of MEM to localize spikes in different vision states. We selected 16 unifocal patients who underwent all-night EEG localizations, and we selected patients who had at minimum 5 spikes in each state. So we selected 9 male, 7 female. They got all-night high-density EEG, 83 electrodes that were glued on the scalp with collodion, and we get very clean recording during the whole night. Our expert was there marking the sleep, so we have the extra measurements to measure sleep, like what we do in polysomnography, so oculogram, EKG, muscle activity, etc. And then you have the different states, so awake, N1, N2, N3, and REM sleep, so in the different section. And in the different sections, an epileptologist marked the occurrence of the spike. So then we define a ground truth, more or less as done in previous studies. So based on what we knew from the patient, so basically, is there a lesion? Do we have a surgery and a resection, or seizure onset zone defined by SEEG? So it depends a bit. So it was defined as a region of interest along the cortex. Just as a note here, we also included the surface of the hippocampus in our source models. It is what you see here, to be more sensitive to the hippocampus. And then you see for each state, you get a number of spikes. So you have all spikes measuring in that state, or sometimes we did also equalize number of spikes, like not to be sensitive to the signal to noise ratio. We made sure we had the same amount of spike in N2, N3 REM awake states. Then we made a series of measures on the scalp measure, as it's been done in the literature before. So we looked at the spike duration, the peak of the amplitude, the signal to noise ratio by comparing the peak amplitude to the background here. We localize at the midpoint during the rising phase of the spike to avoid too much propagations. And also at the peak, we counted the number of channels involved at a specific percentage of the peak to have a notion of the spatial extent. And then we applied MEM source reconstruction. And so we compared our MEM source reconstruction. So here on the cortex plus the 2 hippocampi, as you see here, and we added depth weighted to show that sometimes we were sensitive to get some activity in the hippocampus and on the cortical regions. And then we were comparing those with our ground truth by measuring distance or spatial spread around the source. So here are our results. So we analyzed a total of more than 3,000 epileptic spikes in 16 patients, 7 females, mean age around 33 years old. 10 patients were temporal, 6 were extratemporal, 11 underwent surgery, out of which 8 are classified as seizure-free angle 1A. So let's look at sensor level evaluation as it's been done in the literature before. So I will show you the unequalized and equalized. So this is when you use the total number of spike, and here you make sure you have exactly the same number of spike for each subject in each state. So it might differ for one subject to the other, but it's the same for one subject in every state. And so what we see here is that spikes during REM exhibited significantly smaller amplitude, as you can see here. And also, there were a smaller amplitude and a slightly shorter duration. And but there were no difference. We found so shorter duration, as you can see here. I'm sorry. And there were no difference in signal to noise ratio when we were equalizing the number of spikes. So it's very important to make sure that those results are not sensitive to your signal-to-noise ratio. So by equalizing, having the same number of average in each case, we still see an impact on the amplitude, on the duration of the spikes, but not on the signal-to-noise ratio. And then we wanted to see, let's say, spatial extent at the sensor level. So how can we do that? We counted the proportion of channels that were active above a specific threshold. So for instance, we look at the number of channels that are exhibiting a signal larger than 20% of the peak of the spike. And we did that specifically in each vigilance state. So this means we use the relative threshold. So this 20% of the max is valid for every sleep. Or we did an absolute threshold saying that our reference is the awake state. So this is the second analysis that you see here. And so the relative threshold, we did not see much, but when you use this absolute threshold, so when you compare the number of channels involved at the peak of the spike, then when we use the absolute threshold, so reference in the awake state and equalized number, we see a tiny effect. We see a tiny effect suggesting that there is still significantly less channel involved in REM sleeps compared to N2, N3, and clinical means that it's all the spikes depending on their sleep stage. This is what we are using in the clinical configuration. And so this is in agreement with what is known during the literature, that overall spike during REM sleep seems less extended. So let's go in the source space now. So we evaluated MEM, and this is an example of one patient, and you see the localization in the different sleep stage. And you see that overall, the source reconstruction was very, very consistent across the vigilance states. Overall, our localization was good because in 15 out of 16, we exhibited sublobar concordance with the presumed clinical ground truth, and this for all our vigilance states. So this is also when you use all these spikes or when you use the equalized number of spikes. So let's look at quantitative measure to go over those now. So here we look at D-mean, which is the distance of the spike peak to the presumed focus, and there is not much difference. Or this is the spatial dispersion, which is how much you spread around. So there is not much effect of the spatial dispersions, and overall the distance between the different localization in the different sleep stage were overall very, very consistent. And we specifically estimated the spatial extent of the source by doing a threshold, and we used the same threshold approach than for the scalp level data. So either a relative threshold by taking all the vertex that are showing an activity that is larger than 20% of the peak, as you can see here. So this is in wakefulness, the spike, the topography, and the map, in non-REM and in REM, so very concordant overall. Or we did the absolute threshold. So the threshold was 20% of the activity in the awake state, because here you see the amplitude is slightly smaller. So if you do the same, you see that you reduce the amplitude in the REM activity, but overall the localization is concordant. So when we looked at that in terms of source extent, only with an absolute threshold, we see an effect here, but the effect was small, and overall, all source maps were giving consistent results. And actually, what we did here is that source localization of every single spike using a hierarchical clustering was actually improved when we consider the amplitude in addition to spatial dispersion. So what we did here is we take the source map for all the spikes, and we had a clustering algorithm saying, can you distinguish spikes that were in non-REM, REM, or awake in a clustering manner? And when we included only the spatial shape, it was doing okay, but when it's the spatial shape and the amplitude, it was doing a bit better. So impact. EEG or MEG source imaging of epileptic discharge is clinically relevant and should be considered during presurgical investigation, and we should consider the spatial extent. MEM source imaging allows recovering the location, but also the spatial extent of the generator. And what we found here is, before it's been suggested in the literature that perhaps EEG source imaging is more accurate during REM sleep. Here we say that according to our study, EEG, high-density EEG source imaging is really reliable across vigilant states. Source localizations during REM did not really improve accuracy. It was as accurate in all stages. So the amplitude and the number of spike was the important factor changing the signal-to-noise ratio and the source extent. And so that's it for spike and vigilance state. So overall, we are able to do a good job in high density or targeted low density when we do spike localization. And vigilance state, sleep is not impacting that much the result. We remain accurate. But of course, sometimes you record your patients and you don't measure spikes. So is there something we can do in this context? And of course, when you look at the literature, whether it's in fMRI or EEG or MEG, there is a great tendency to look at resting state connectivity, resting state oscillations. So we wanted to see how our localization methods are behaving in that context. So let's talk about resting state activity. I'll just mention this great work done first in MEG by Jawata Afnan before showing our EEG very recent results. So the work of Jawata has been published. So we wanted to show whether MEG source imaging of healthy control, when you localize resting state oscillation, can be validated as a group level when we have intracranial normal EEG data. And we wanted to see whether MEM is able to do a good job in these conditions. So what we used as a ground truth, we were very lucky because, again, we're collaborating a lot with Birgit Fauscher from Duke and John Gottman at McGill at the MNI. And this is work that was initiated at the MNI at McGill, is we're going to use a ground truth, an intracranial, the MNI intracranial EEG atlas of normal resting state oscillation. So this is a great multicentric study. We have different, more recent version of it. The database keeps increasing. And the idea is they selected, it's a multicentric data. They selected stereotaxic intracranial EEG data from different patients from different epilepsy centers. And they selected data that were all in LC regions. So everything that was epileptic was discarding. So healthy regions, eyes closed. And in this first study was done during wakefulness. And then we have an extended version that was done during sleep. So overall, when we plug the data from the different subject and different centers, we have a very good coverage of the whole brain. And this is going to be our ground truth when we want to evaluate the ability to do the localization of resting state activity. So it provides such an opportunity. Of course, in the atlas, we have data from different subjects with different electrode positions. You know how you generally implant one patient. You never have one patient implanting everywhere. So it's only a comparison that could be at the population level. So in this first published study, what we just did is we selected MEG on resting state subjects and we compared, so we localized in different bands. We projected in the SEEG space and we compared with the SEEG atlas. And as you can see in this example, you have in black the distributions for the angular gyrus of the power spectrum in the intracranial EEG atlas. And in blue here, and when you remove the 1/f in orange here, you have what we were reconstructing with MEG. And overall, it was quite concordant. This is an example of a deep region in the hippocampus. Something we noted here is that overall it was not bad, but in the hippocampus, our method, but also all the other standard method, minimum norm, S-Loretta, beamformer, all localize a very huge peak in the alpha band, whereas when you put your electrode in the hippocampus, you don't have alpha activity. So this was published in MEG. There is an extension of this work looking at patterns of functional connectivity. And now we want to extend that with Winnie, who's doing a PhD with Birgit Fauscher at Duke. We wanted to extend this work in the EEG domain. So it's a very rich data set that has been acquired mainly at McGill. So selection of 35 healthy controls. These are the sex distribution and age ranger, and they all underwent all-night EEG high-density recording. These are healthy controls. 83 electrodes that have been glued on the surface, and their sleep efficiency was around an average of 80%. And so EEG data were segmented. So we had awake data and then N2, N3, and REM sleep. We got our EEG pre-processing. So we have our clean EEG data. In the meantime, we acquired MRI data. We built a head model incorporating the cortical surface and the hippocampus and the scalp surface. And we applied wavelet MEM to reconstruct ongoing resting state EEG activity in stable period in the different sleep stage. Okay. And of course, we also co-registered the position of all the electrodes from the MNI intracranial EEG atlas. And what we did, once we get all our WaveMem map, we projected our EEG sources into the SEEG space of the atlas. So we estimated a virtual intracranial EEG data. We can do so, the paper describing the method is here, by applying an intracranial EEG forward model. So in a way, I have EEG on the scalp, I'm getting EEG sources on the cortex, and then I'm applying a model to estimate a virtual SEEG data. And we got those virtual SEEG data in the awake N2, N3, and REM data for all our channels. And these are all the available channels, more than 2,000. And then we get the ground truth. So the ground truth is there is an extension of the atlas of Birgit Frauscher. It's published by Nicola von Ellenrieder, which is now extended this atlas in different sleep stage. So we have the atlas definition looking at 1 minute of data in every subject in different regions. So for the same channel in those different sleep stage. And now that we have those resting state data from our ground truth from the MNI IEG atlas, and we have what we reconstructed from scalp EEG, we can compare them. So we group the different channels in different regions from this atlas, MICAI atlas, in 38 regions, and then we compare the power spectrum or the peaks and so on. So these are my final slides. So these are very, very new results that we are preparing right now. So first, we compared our result between EEG and MEG. So this is awake, and this is the power spectrum in the different bands in intracranial EEG, what we are reconstructing in EEG after converting into this SEEG space, and the same for MEG. And as you can see, in delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma band, we see some very good representation. For instance, you see that even the beta localization was probably slightly better in EEG than in MEG. We have a very nice alpha posterior localization and so on. So this is resting state in healthy controls compared to the SEEG atlas. And in the SEEG atlas, these are only normal non-epileptic contacts. Here it's a comparison of the spectrum. So again, you have in black what the ground truth is telling. So this is in black, this is from the SEEG atlas, still awake for the moment. And in yellow here, what we are reconstructing from EEG sources, and in orange, what we are reconstructing from MEG sources. In some lateral, in some more cortical regions and some medial regions, including the hippocampus. Interestingly, as you can see here, I showed you that in MEG, we were doing a big mistake in the hippocampus when localizing alpha. It's not that problematic in EEG. We're doing a better job in EEG, probably due to the different kind of depth sensitivity of EEG versus MEG when we use gradiometer. This is the distribution of the sleep measure that we did. So we have the total sleep time in N2, N3, and non-REM, the total sleep time, the total recording time. So it's a kind of normal sleep microstructure. And now we're going to compare EEG source imaging, so virtual IEG, to the ground truth IEG data. And so you have the IEG data in the different bands, what we measure with VIEG, and then the difference. And overall, again, there are some good correspondence. When it's negative, it means that our localization using scalp EEG was overestimating what we recover in SEEG data. And this is what we get in REM sleep, which is slightly similar actually. And then in N2 sleep is perhaps a bit of more mistake in gamma bands, but of course we have the amplitude are very low here because we are getting more activity in the slow band and in N3. And another representation, this is for the angular gyrus, so a cortical surface. So here you see the power spectrum after we remove the aperiodic 1/f effect during awake REM N2 and 3. And you see here, again, what we recover for IEG. So in the awake, you see a clear alpha peak, then tends to disappear, and you see more slow activity during N3. And we have a very nice correspondence between the atlas and what we reconstruct from EEG. And this is the same, but now from the, yeah, I did a mistake. I wanted to show you the hippocampus there, but the picture is not the same. So you can believe me, but it was what we saw before, which was what you see, sorry. What you see here, that the alpha activity in awake was more, and then of course in deep sleep you have more slow activity. Sorry for that. This is overall in the different sleep stage, looking at all the different channels, and you see what we are, all the peaks we are reconstructing from EEG and from intracranial EEG, and then this is from scalp EEG after doing source imaging and projection in the SEEG space. So this is the awake. REM profile is not so different than awake. And then when we go in N2 and N3, as expecting, we are getting more slow activity and some very nice correspondence. So these are our very first results. This is quite new. And so just to conclude my presentation for today, few take-home messages. So first, I hope I managed to convince you that it's important to consider the spatial extent of the generator when we localize either spike or oscillatory patterns, high frequency oscillation, ictal data, and this when we do EEG or make source imaging. So we showed in a paper that using such a method, we demonstrated that spike localization of EEG using MEG was consistent across vision and states. And what we are doing next now, because we have this nice estimation of the source with the spatial extent, we want to use this information to guide quantitatively the implantation of intracranial EEG. Just a slight note about technique. I talk a lot about MEM method for its sensitivity to the spatial extent. In our different papers, we clearly show that linear technique like standard technique, minimum norms, Loretta, beamformer, they are not sensitive to the spatial extent. There are other methods proposed in the literature that are also nonlinear and sensitive to the spatial extent, as this method fast IRES proposed by the group of Binhe, or exomusic that has been proposed by the group of Rennes with Laurent Albera, for instance. But overall, our package is highly available because it is in Brainstorm. And what we showed at the end of the talk today is it seems accurate to do localization when we don't have spikes, just to localize ongoing resting state oscillation. It's quite accurate on cortical regions for both MEG and EEG. It seems to be quite stable across different vigilant states. And a little note that we should be a bit more careful for deep structure because there might be some leakage, but this seems more problematic with MEG than with EEG. As a clinical applications, what we want to do next, and it's been done also in the literature, but we wanted to validate the method first, is we can compare, detect abnormal resting state oscillatory patterns on patients when we compared resting state localization in patients to a normative database of healthy controls. And the group of Peter Taylor in UK has been doing a lot on this. And so we have, I think, a good sensitive method to do that. Finally, a last note is that all our packages are available in Brainstorm software. This is how it looks. This is a spike with MEM versus minimum norm localization. So there are nice tutorials if you want to try it. If you're interested, please join us in Montreal for ICTAL 2025 conference. That's going to be early June. And at the beginning, during the education session, we'll have a MEM workshop to teach people how to localize spike, fast oscillation, and seizure using MEM. So we welcome you there. And finally, I'd like to thank the whole team. It's a big team. Some of the key members that have been active in what I showed here are highlighted in red, either in my lab or together with Birgit Frauscher lab, and main collaborator, including Birgit Frauscher, Jean Gottman, and Jean-Marc Lina, to name some of them. I'd like to finish also by saying that if some of you are interested in joining our group, Birgit Frauscher and myself are recruiting notably epileptologists to work on research projects with us. Thank you very much. Thank you for your attentions, and I'm there if you have questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for presenting all of your work that you've done in this space. It's so interesting to see the different methods across the modalities, especially as they pertain to the vigilant states. And also seeing localization done on oscillating patterns. That's a really interesting new space to explore. And we're going to open up to any questions that you might have for Professor Grova, as he's on right now. We're getting some great feedback, and thank yous for sharing your time with us today. We have a question from Daniel Goldenholtz about MEM and why it's not compared to the L1 minimum norm solutions.
It could definitely, we just did not had the opportunity. We compared with several other methods. That's one of them. Yeah, the L1 will do something also a bit more sparse, a bit more focused. So probably it could go there. It was not directly available in the package. In the past, in our earliest paper, we compared MEM with some methods that are implemented in SPM package that are named MSP or COH, which are Bayesian technique that are also trying to be like MSP is multiple sparse prior. So it's also a method trying to sparsify the spatial prior to have something more focal. And we did one paper with the group of Rennes comparing with exomusic, which is also a technique that it's an extension of beamformer trying to detect the spatial extent. So we did many comparison, not all of them. L1 minimum norm would definitely be a one to consider.
Thank you. We also have a question from Garima Shukla. Were only single spike populations selected for the study on ESI in different vigilant states? And what is your approach for patients who have multiple spike populations?
Yeah. So of course, to do this comparison, the main thing that we did here was to select clear-cut patients who were showing mainly one spike type, very reproducible in the different, so that we were able to compare. And whether we are comparing with vigilant state or not, even when we are just doing clinical analysis, this is usually the case that we are marking spikes, and we have usually to classify different spike types, and we do specific localization for different spike type. And this is usually in discussion with the clinician. So Birgit Frauscher, our expert in source imaging in the lab, is Dr. Shifa Wabdallah. And we're discussing with her what seems more relevant in the clinical context. So it might be one type, it might be two type. That definitely depends on the patient. There's something else that we published a few years ago is to propose what we call a consensus map. It means that we are localizing all the single spikes, and at the end we are doing clustering, and we are looking at what are those big clusters that corresponds to different spike types. This is something that we are doing in clinical practice.
Great, thank you. I had a question relating to some of the results you had across the vigilant states. Do you think that this, the effect you saw on the spikes from the REM sleep, do you think that changes the way that we should approach trying to capture these spikes in a clinical setting?
There is a big questions about those spikes, whether they make sense, whether they are, how interesting they are. In this study with the patient we found that it was not so relevant, like comparing the standard clinical spike, like marking any spike and doing the localizations or localizing in RAM. It was slightly more focused in RAM, but overall it was about the same. Also because our method is perhaps a bit more accurate in space. That's another point. But I'm not saying that it's the case for all the patients, and I think this definitely deserve further studies. There are other spike type that are highly relevant. I know notably in her SEEG work, Birgit Frauscher has investigating a lot the concept of spike gamma, so the notion of a spike and a gamma oscillation rising on around the spike as an important markers. This is something we also try to localize from the scalp as an important marker. So which are the spikes that are more interesting in these clinical setups? These deserve further studies. I'm not saying that any RAM spike should not, but in this first study was not drastically different.
Thank you. We have a question from Swarup Sonawani. What montage do you use in ESI? Is it a Laplacian?
No, we are not. It's to do the source reconstruction. Of course, the Laplacian montage can be used to have this notion of extent from the scalp point of view, but when we apply source imaging and because of the foreign model we're using just a referential montage. So all the source localization map has been localized using referential montage, average reference montage.
And then we have a question from Sapna Pandi. What tools were used to calculate the statistics like signal to noise ratio and peak amplitude of the spike?
That was done by my fellow Tamir Avigdor. I'm not sure. I think he implemented his own tools to do that, probably in MATLAB. I assume looking at the statistical analysis that was probably done with R, I assume. But to measure, like in the paper, we are describing how we are measuring exactly the spike amplitude, the signals. All those metrics were done, I would say, on the average spike, not on single spike. So we were averaging spike using equalized number of spike or spike specific, but yeah.
And I actually got a response that MATLAB was custom code in MATLAB.
Okay.
That was up Tamir. Thank you, Tamir. Yeah. And then how was the D-min and the spread of spikes in the region calculated? Was that also the same tool?
Yeah, so this is tools we've been using a lot. I've been mentioning, I don't think we put them available in Brainstorm, but we could definitely do. Or if some people are interested, there are other groups that have contacted us to get the code for those metrics. Feel free to contact us. We will provide the code. Demin is not very difficult. Demin basically is just measuring a distance between the source map peak and your ground truth, whatever it is. It is a simulated ground truth. It is a cavity. It is a ground truth defined by the expert. So it's just a distance. And SD is an interesting metric that we are using a lot in my lab. That was originally proposed by Mullins in the group of Mattia Malainen in Boston. So it's really measuring, you have your ground truth, and when you spread around your ground truth, you are weighting by the distance, the amplitude, the energy of your source. So it's a kind of weighted distance. So the more the source map is spreading, the larger will be that distance. And it's actually a very nice metric to measure the spatial spread. We are using in other paper, we've been using area under the RC curve also. These are complementary tools that we have been using in several of our papers.
Great. And then this will be our last question for today. This is from Juan Appendino. I'm wondering if in your atlas used as the reference, you consider age-related changes, like young adults, elderly children.
Yeah, I don't have the exact result on that. It's a key point. I think we addressed that in a paper. We are using, so there is no children for sure. It's only adult or perhaps adolescent. I'm not 100% sure, but the age range was was fixed. We did not regress out here the effect of age, but this is something we definitely would like to take into account. What we checked is that our age range and gender distribution was quite similar in our group of healthy subjects and in the patients that were involved in the atlas. That we have checked, but then we did not regress out to see. And it's clear that there might be impact of age and sex distribution on those patterns. And probably if we want to detect abnormality, to detect patient-based abnormality, these are confound we should regress out.
Awesome. So one last question just came in. This will be the last one. Jeremy Wilson said, how useful is scalp EEG for gathering accurate gamma oscillations for mapping epileptic zones?
So, can you repeat the question first?
Yeah. How useful is the scalp EEG for gathering accurate gamma oscillations to map the epileptic zones?
I'm not sure I understand the questions. Perhaps one thing is, so in terms what we define the scout, we define the reference regions, which is based on what we know from the epilepsy of that subject. So as I said, if we have surgery, we can use the cavity. If we have SEEG, we can use some information from SEEG from the lesion. So when I was showing this was a reference, a clinical reference, it might be a mix of all that interpreted by the clinicians. Regarding gamma activity or spike and gamma activity, we developed, and there is a paper of Tamir showing that we can look in the time frequency domain and we can disentangle in the time frequency domain the spike from the fast oscillation, and it's a good. It should be that the fast oscillation is a little blob. It's not just an artifact from the transition of the spike, because if you just filter a spike, you're going to have a huge broadband activity with some fast activity. This is not the gamma from spike gamma. So you have to detect this gamma very carefully, and it was done very precisely in the paper, the clinical neurophysiology paper I showed from Tamira Victor. And then what we are doing is when we have localized this little fast oscillation in the time frequency domain, we're using wavelet MEM. So we are only reconstructing the time frequency box corresponding to this time and this oscillation range. So we are sure we are disentangling this localization from the spike localization. I'm not sure I answered the question, but this is the way we are dealing with spike gamma.
Yeah, I think you definitely addressed the concept that they were trying to learn more about. Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much again for your time today and sharing all of your knowledge and work in this space. And if you have further questions, please reach out to Persyst and we'll help direct you to the right resource. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you again, Professor Grova.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.